Do you know there? It's not all flashy, you know. Answering these questions is meaningful work for athletes who are in trouble and they need help with things. Do you know, it can't all be, why is Liu Xiaojun off steroids, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's good, honest to God.
Just honest to God helping people.
Down to earth. Questions about training. And unfortunately for combat sports athletes, they are the most at risk. Because
Of terrible information.
And they've no one to turn to, you know?
No.
So that's what we're here.
That's why we're here.
Help people with. First one of those people is actually helped last week, but Joe did come in with a second question. Joe said, at what point during a prep for a judo competition would you include something like 400 or 800 meter repeats? I find on the one hand they get noticeable improvements to cardio from them, but on the other hand they're so fatiguing it's hard to know what it would look like when in a training block. I'm pretty sure I shouldn't be doing the week of a competition, but besides that I'm not sure where to fit them in to get the most benefit. Speaking of judo, before we get going on that question, so Takashi Sasaki is a Japanese judo weapon. A murderer.
Murder.
So at the Nur Sultan 2022 Cup, Nur Sultan is the leader of Turkmenistan, I think, or was the leader, or is a place. So, no, not often. Sacrifice throw. Watch this.
Sick.
Watch this.
I know what this video is.
Where is it going? I show this to everyone in the club.
He's
out
done.
Cold. Out cold.
Out cold. Kazakhstan.
He really said that word.
Kazakhstan.
Look at him. He's a little like.
Yeah.
He's like a little robot.
That loop choke was sick.
Imagine, like, that's vicious.
Yeah, it's viscous.
They
not easily poured.
Imagine how good he'd be at jiu-jitsu if he gave me a few years.
Yeah, it's absolutely sick.
Frightening.
Yeah.
Frightening.
Anyway, before anyone comments as well on my pronunciation of Kazakhstan as Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
When you're in Kazakhstan, that's how they actually say it.
It is. No, truly it is how they...
Just before the pronunciation police who can't pronounce my name start policing us.
Yeah, Derry Fitz.
Fitzgerald.
Anyway, on to the question.
On to the question. So it's a perfectly logical question, right? 400s and 800s, very, phenomenally useful. Really, really good too. In my head, how I organise them is they're one of the mainstays of kind of aerobic conditioning. And particularly with the 400s, they're one of the mainstays of kind of building lactic threshold or pushing that lactic threshold up. You're in that massively beneficial zone between all-out sprinting and power production work and also building some sort of aerobic capacity. Also due to the time element of the 400 meters, most of us are going to run a 400 meters in 60 or 70 seconds, or most good athletes will. That's a very valuable or very useful or very applicable time domain to be putting in a large amount of effort. So if you look at, obviously the judo fights are going on for more than 60 seconds, but in terms of all out efforts before you take a break or before you disengage, 60 seconds is around where you're at in terms of your kind of energy system. So 400s and 800s, firstly, a really, really useful tool. Now, when we're planning out our training period, if that's 16 weeks or 12 weeks or 10 weeks, where do they fall in? They're usually not right at the very, very start, and they're usually not right at the very, very end, but most of that intermediary period, so the very start of training for a judo athlete should be very much preparatory work, right? You're in your slightly longer distances, or building up to slightly longer distances, so you might be doing 1k repeats, 3k repeats, some 5k work. Long, slow distance. You're just building up a work capacity within the body, and you're making sure nothing is too fast, nothing is too long, nothing is too arduous on the system itself. Once you've done probably 3 or 4 or 6 weeks of those kind of longer distance, slow speed runs, then you start bringing in your 800s, and then you start bringing in your 400s. Now, the difference between doing 800s and 400s when you're just 6 weeks into a 16-week block versus 14 weeks into a 16-week block is very, very different. At the start, we'll tend not to focus too much on pace. We'll tend to focus on the actual kind of intervals in between, right? So take, for example, if my working set was 10 sets of 400 meters, at the start of a block, my main aim is to get through that, and my other focus is to just make sure the intervals in between each of those are very well controlled. So I'm keeping my heart rate up quite high the entire time. I'll probably have a rest period of somewhere around 60 to 120 seconds in between each of those 400 meter repeats. Now, if we compare that to at the end of our training block, so we might be 4 weeks out from competition or 3 weeks out from competition, my 400 meters, the session might be 4 or 5 400 meter repeats, but in every single one of those, I'll be giving myself the absolute best opportunity to run that as fast as possible. So because I'll have been fitter, or because I'll now be more fit or more aerobically fit, I won't need as much rest, but I'll still be given more rest time. So 2.5, 3, 4 minutes in between each of my 400 meter repeats. I'll ensure obviously the form is extremely good. I'll want to be powerful through the entirety of that 400 meter loop or the 800 meter loop, whatever it is you're doing. And then I'll make sure I don't keep doing 400s until I get slower. So if you were to track the 400 meter pace over the course of the 10 400s I'll do at the start of a training block, it's very likely those last 2 or 3 400 meter repeats won't be the fastest I'll run on the day. As I get towards the end of my training block and I get closer to competition, every single one of those 400 should be getting continuously faster, or at the very least I'll have to ensure they don't get slower. So that's kind of how we add them in. That's how I'd write them in if I was programming. And the main thing is maybe the week before the competition, or even 2 weeks before the competition, you're going to be pulling those 400s and particularly the 800s out, as they are very, very fatiguing. You'll still keep some quite aerobically demanding work in, but it is very likely that aerobically demanding work will come from your actual judo rounds or your judo specific conditioning, and they won't be coming from your running stuff as much.
So it's always important, Joe, and this is kind of how you asked me your previous question that we got to, is thinking about your training in certain blocks, and it's probably one of the biggest mistakes we do see in combat sports, like I think we mentioned last time, is that we're not thinking about our training like we would as other athletes. We're thinking about our training in a way, in just isolation. We're thinking about the next competition, the next one done, and then the times when we take rests or we take downtimes in training is usually in forced training, where life comes in the way or we get injured or both of these things happen, and we take extended periods off of training. Then we get back to training, we see a competition in an unreasonably short time frame, try and train for it, doesn't go very well, then we'll do another competition. We repeat this endless cycle of poorly planned training. When we look at Olympic athletes, countries will plan 4 years in advance with their Olympic athletes how they'll plan their training. A very famous weightlifting book, for example, on the programming is the multi-year system of training of a weightlifter, where they literally talk about the system you take a 10-year-old right up until their first Olympics and how they plan that. So all the combat sports athletes look at this. I really want to encourage you to think about your training in segments and in periods of training where you need to be doing certain things, work in certain skills, and this kind of question plays into that. So you're peaking for stuff, you're taking downtime from stuff, you're working your S&C stuff, however, and how much and varying degrees of importance that is for your training for the S&C, like we talked about. A little bit different for combat sports across the spectrum. So for strikers, it'll be a little bit different to our judo and our BJJ athletes, for example. So in this case, think about it in this typical fashion. The cult of periodization, as you know, we're in our heads of our idol here, of course. The stag is the idol of the cult of periodization, and we think about these things in what block am I training earn, and we think about this in that typical fashion. So very far from competition, not very specific with our programming, close to competition, super specific with our program. Everything else falls to the wayside. We do less gym work, we do less intense gym work, we do less aerobic work. We just do enough to keep us taking over. We peak for these events and we peak for a certain period of time. Combat sports can stay peaked for a little bit longer. If there's a bigger fight or bigger session, you peak harder for that. And then there's a transition period after that where we take some downtime, we recover from training, we recover from the psychological stress, the physiological stress, we allow our tendons, our joints, our ligaments, our hormone system, everything else to recover slightly from the stress of training. And of course, combat sports is a huge amount of stress during training, so it's really important that we make sure we're at distinct times of our training, we're very purposeful with these times in training, and then we're making sure we're getting the job done, and then we're moving on to the next one, and we're not lingering too long or we're spending too short in those time periods. We're getting what we need to done at right times of year, and these 400s and 800 meters, as Fitz described, play nicely into certain parts of these, and once used correctly, they are phenomenal, and they will streamline your progress faster than you would if you just trained as hard as possible all the time. Funnily enough, Clarence has actually a great video on his Patreon, and it's called Learning Slow is Actually Learning Faster, and he takes it through as a weightlifter who just trains as hard as possible and doesn't spend the time learning the basics. But it is a very good example of how taking your time to do things and some downtime will actually speed up your progress in the long run, because you'll preempt poor decisions and roadblocks, or you will at least avoid as many of those as possible. Thanks, Joe.
Joe's asking some great questions.